very good morning to all. Greetings from Singapore. It's really wonderful to have been able to get all of you to attend our 5th NTS-Asia Consortium annual conference. And we have as a general theme for this year, Asian security in a post-COVID-19 environment. We have, as I guess, experienced the multitude impact of COVID-19 in our daily lives and in our work. And this is really, I guess, a wonderful time, a year after, a little over a year since the COVID outbreak. It's a good time for us to come together, reflect, and really share what this pandemic has done to our lives and to understand the various challenges that we face. We all come from different regions, and that's the purpose of the NTS-Asia Consortium is really to have this platform to be able to exchange experiences across regions. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, by way of background, the consortium, NTS-Asia Consortium, has been around for at least 13 years. And we've had, over the years, expanded this consortium and to about over 30 members, and some are active and some are, are still joining us, even though they are not participating in our workshops, but are very much around and sharing their research. We had, in fact, an opportunity last year to come together. We couldn't, of course, hold the annual conference because of the pandemic, but we thought we could, we could just bring together and share some of what we were doing at that time. And in August of last year, a few of us had this virtual meeting, and just to sort of touch base and just to check on, how the pandemic has affected us. And at that time in August, we really did not think it was going to last this long, because the impact was really it was at that time getting very bad in terms of the impact on the economy and health, and especially the impact on vulnerable communities. And in fact, the first session of this 3-day conference, we are breaking it up so it won't be too heavy. We have 2 sessions each per day, but session 1 really looks at the crisis impact on inequality and vulnerable groups. Before I open this, I turn to the next session. I just wanted to give a some update on the activities of the consortium. For those of you who would like to know more about what we do, and for our members, we actually have a revamped website. It's much better in terms of user experience. We have also updated it in terms of the resources that you can find, and also the experts, that work on a wide range of NTS challenges. We have also enhanced the contents by being able to republish some of the external publications of the members of the consortium, so that they will also have a wider platform to disseminate the work. We also have a greater outreach through the creation of a Facebook page and regular posts. And to this, really, I want to thank my colleague, Margaret Zinberen, who has been leading the work of the Secretariat together with the team, Joey and Shin, and of course, with the support of the members of the NTS Center here in RSIS. So I really hope that next year we can have a better year and we can get everyone here in Singapore to have, to do this sharing. But without further ado, since time is limited, I would now like to invite my colleague, Tamara Naya, who will be chairing a session on crisis impact on inequality and vulnerable groups. Over to you, Tamara, please.
Welcome to our NTS, the first session of our NTS Consortium annual conference. Just before we start, just a few words. In only a few weeks, COVID-19 has profoundly changed our lives. Beyond the immediate impacts on health, jobs, and incomes, the epidemic has also increasingly affected people's social relations, their trust in other people and institutions, increased their anxiety and their worry, and of course, their sense of personal security and a sense of belonging. Now, immediate short-term government responses are needed to save lives and livelihoods today, but the crisis could provide useful lessons for longer-term change to build greater resilience in the systems that support well-being over time in a post-COVID-19 world. Now, this includes building social connections and social capital, opening up new ways of working and living, and of course, reinforcing the capacity of public services and social safety nets to react in times of crisis. It also builds a very strong case for redoubling efforts to reduce and mitigate our sources of vulnerability, or identify our sources of vulnerability associated with job insecurity, status in society, poor environmental quality, and social isolation. And with that, we see a connection with our theme for this fifth annual conference, which is Asian security in a post-COVID-19 environment. And more specifically, as Melly has said, in today's session, this morning's session, which is crisis impact on inequality and vulnerable groups. Now, as economic growth and development can have an aggregative effect of pushing everyone up, it takes a crisis to show how far some of us can fall. And this panel discusses these issues of inequality and how, in considering carefully the many faceted and disproportionate suffering of vulnerable groups have faced, and more importantly, how we might be able to better build stronger communities and stronger lives in a post-pandemic world. And with that hopeful introduction, allow me to introduce our panel of speakers this morning, and I will be introducing them in the order that they will be speaking. So first we have Dr. Malika Joseph. Dr. Joseph is a senior fellow at the Women in Security, Conflict Management and Peace, WISCOM, and a visiting fellow at the Center for Policy Research in CPR in New Delhi. She has served as a policy advisor and regional coordinator for the Asia Pacific at the Hague-based Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict. She is part of many global and regional networks working on the security sector, human security, countering violent extremism, conflict prevention, regional architectures, and global governance. Our next speaker is Ms. Michelle Andrina. So Ms. Michelle is a quantitative researcher who is interested in the issues of children, labor, poverty, and public policy. Her previous research with Smeru Research Institute includes child labor in agriculture, the livelihood of low-income families, and the parenting program evaluation. She is currently pursuing her master's degree in public policy at the School of Government and Public Policy in Indonesia. Our third speaker is Dr. Jyoti M Patanya. Dr. Jyoti is a senior fellow and chairperson of the Outreach Committee at the Center for Land Warfare Studies in New Delhi. She is also the founding editor of online Indian Journal of Peace and Conflict Resolution and a podcaster on Indian conflict resolutions. Now, she has earned her doctorate in political science, MPhil and MA degrees in international studies from the School of International Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. And she has been awarded the master's degree in advanced studies in peace and conflict resolution studies from the European University Center for Peace Studies in Austria. She has contributed in various journals and newspapers, both in India and abroad. And she has authored a book, India and Pakistan Confidence Building Measures. Her upcoming book is entitled Deep State Continuum, Pakistan and Implications on India. Our last speaker is our NTS Center's very own Ms. Margaret Zinberen. Margaret is a PhD candidate and an associate research fellow at the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies here at RSIS. Her research focuses on climate change, governance, and climate mitigation, especially in low carbon transition in Southeast Asia. She is also currently serving as the manager of the NTS-Asia Consortium Secretariat. So those are our speakers for this session. Now, before we continue, please allow me to remind everyone to mute your mics while the presentation is ongoing. I would also kindly ask the speakers to keep their presentation to the allocated 15 minutes so that we might have a robust Q&A session after the presentations are done. Participants are also kindly reminded to type their questions in the chat function and to also please state which of the speakers your questions or comments are addressed to, or whether you would like the whole panel to take your questions. And with those housekeeping matters out of the way, may I ask our first speaker, Dr. Malika Joseph, to start us off this morning, please. Dr. Malika, if you will.
Thank you, Tamara. And it's really an honor to be here with all of you today and have an opportunity to present on behalf of WISCOM. Thank you, Melly, for that. WISCOM actually undertook a very timely and interesting study last year. It was on SDG 5 on gender equality and explore its intersectionality with other SDGs on inequality, poverty, education, and most importantly, SDG 16 on security, peace, and justice. So what I'll be doing today is to share some of the highlights from that study because I think it's pertinent for this morning's sessions on inequality and vulnerable groups. Next slide, please. So just briefly on South Asia, to give you the context, a third of the world's poor live in South Asia, and it's home to about 860 million women. Until recently, it was considered one of the fastest growing regions economically, and it had managed to close the gender gap in quite significantly across various sectors. However, it still continues to be the second largest, it still continues to have the second largest gender gap in the world. And according to the latest global gender gap report, it will take 195 years to close the gender gap in the region. Last year, it remained hopeful of bridging the gap with 71 years. However, it has regressed. It is one of the regions to have regressed significantly in the last 1 year. And South Asia's female labor force participation is about just 28%, and it is reducing. And gender gaps in education have narrowed significantly, but literacy among women continued to be lower than men. The number of children, particularly girls, dropping out of school and not completing their secondary school education is simply too large to be ignored. Structural and actual violence against women widens gender gap and increases inequality between men and women, and particularly also among women. However, South Asia is not on track to achieve gender equality by 2030. And this was before COVID-19 and the subsequent lockdown, which has exacerbated pre-existing challenges and created new impediments to achieving gender equality in the region. Next slide, please. South Asia's female poverty rate before the pandemic was about 10%. It has now been revised to 13%. The UNDP has further revised the estimate for female poverty rate in 2030 from 15.8 to 18.6%, which eventually means about 121 poor women for every 100 poor men. That's about 150 million women driven to poverty. The economic lockdown triggered by the pandemic is set to increase poverty due to job losses, disproportionately impacting vulnerable groups. In Bangladesh, the ready-made sector, which employs about 3 million women, is the worst hit. A quarter of the garment workers have lost their jobs due to the declining global orders. Next slide, please. When we move to livelihood, in South Asia, women are already overrepresented in the informal sector. And even in the formal sector, women experience high levels of horizontal and vertical segregation and receive much lower wages. For instance, in India, women earn just about 1/5 of the male income. And women's jobs and livelihoods are more vulnerable in the COVID-19 pandemic globally. And it's about 1.8 times more vulnerable than men. Women make up about 39% of the global employment. However, they account for about 54% of the job losses. And one of the main reasons is also the disproportional unpaid care work that is undertaken by women world over, particularly during the pandemic. In India, this increased by almost 30%. Um, as per the International Labour Organization statistics, men in Asia and the Pacific perform the lowest amount of unpaid work globally, which translated is about 28 minutes in a day in Pakistan and 31 minutes in a day for men in in India, in contrast to Indian women who spend about 297 minutes a day doing domestic work. Just about a quarter of men are engaged in unpaid work compared to 4/5 of women. If women were to be in formal work such as men, the Indian GDP is estimated to increase by almost 1.4%. Another factor that keeps these women out of work until the economy bounces back are a myriad of traditional mindsets and values. According to an estimate of the Global World Values Survey, more than half the respondents in South Asia and the MENA region felt that men have more right to a job than women when jobs are scarce. Next slide, please. Just to give a snapshot on violence, gender-based violence is endemic in South Asia. For instance, in Bhutan, it is about 26%, in Bangladesh, 53%, and Pakistan, it is as high as 85%. And if you look at India, over about 400,000 crimes against women were reported in 2019, a third of which were perpetrated by the women's partners, husbands, and their in-laws. One-fourth of those who experienced spousal violence sustained physical injury, including eye injuries, sprains, broken bones, broken teeth, etc. Rape constituted about 8% of all the crimes reported against women, with about 32,000 rape cases. And an almost equal number of child rapes happened, which is about like 26,000. That's about 3 women and 3 children raped every hour. And COVID-19 and the ensuing lockdown has increased violence against women worldwide. On the one hand, the factors that trigger violence like stress, restricted mobility, unemployment, job loss, and financial instability have increased domestic violence incidences. On the other hand, it has also made a help and assistance that was available to these women almost inaccessible. For instance, the Indian National Commission on Women registered twice the number of domestic violence cases between March and April 2020. And in a span of just 11 days during the lockdown due to COVID, the government helpline registered 92,000 child abuse cases in the family and the communities. In Bangladesh, there was a 4-fold increase in the number of calls to women helplines. Next slide, please. Another impact that we also feel is the very low representation and participation of women in political processes. Given the enormity of structural, physical, and emotional violence that women suffer, South Asian governments must have accountable state institutions, independent judiciary, gender-sensitive law enforcement agencies, and a free and stable political environment. Unfortunately, only 4 of the countries in the region, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, have any laws prohibiting domestic violence. And added to that, the low conviction rate for crimes against women, particularly sexual offenses, is extremely low. In India, it actually reduced from about 27% conviction rate in 2006 to just about 18.9% in 2016. In South Asia, women make less than about 5% of the police force and less than 10% of judges. And the political participation stands at 20% representation in cabinets and Panchayat Raj institutions. Women's low representation in political, economic, and security decision-making levels particularly impedes their participation in social dialogue, collective bargaining, or policy development. Next slide, please. Coming to the most important driver or a catalyst that can actually overturn some of these negative trends that we find in South Asia is education. This is one sector which has been severely impacted due to COVID-19. And education is the, as I said, is the single most significant factor that determines the outcome of every gender-related program in South Asia. In why it is important is like in India, 3 out of the 4 trafficked women are illiterate. The prevalence of child marriages, teenage pregnancies are higher among communities with little or no education. According to key facts on violence against women put out by the WHO, men who have low education levels are more likely to perpetrate violence against women. Likewise, women with low levels of education experience more intimate partner violence. The economic cost of children who've been out of school also is like equally alarming. According to the World Bank, the report on COVID-19 on the informal sector, the lockdown across South Asia kept about 391 million students out of school. Minimum, and it argues that a minimum of 5 months out of school and accompanying learning losses have a lifetime impact on a generations of students' productivity. And to put a figure to it, the World Bank says that about South Asia will lose about 600 to 800 billion dollars in future earnings due to the current learning losses that has been triggered by the pandemic and the subsequent lockdown and online learning. We must be mindful that this does not include the enormous inequality that's also created among students due to the lack of smartphones, laptops, internet, or for online classes. For instance, in India, just about 8% of the students enrolled in government schools had actually any technology by which they could join the online classes. And school closures have also equally impacted nutrition among children who are dependent on the midday meal schemes. Next slide, please. So looking ahead on what exactly we can do in this time when we are still we're still experiencing the second or the third wave of COVID, and we are still not actually in a post-COVID environment. Next slide, please. One is to have a gender responsive health program. So studies from countries experienced from past epidemics highlight that health outcomes for the entire population can be obtained only if they take gender along with other intersecting characteristics like age, disability, pregnancy, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, etc. So we have this portal which is called the Sex Gender COVID-19 Health Policy Portal, which tracks what various governments are doing with regard to their response, COVID response, and intersecting with gender. And they do it along various policy areas, and they find that there is a pervasive gender blindness across all policy areas, across all regions, and also the country, despite their country's income levels. So among the 388 policies that the portal reviewed, just about 9% were found to address the role of gender in driving their health outcomes. 4 of the 76 countries reviewed they felt they reviewed better, and the 4 of them are listed there, which is like Bangladesh, Canada, India, and South Sudan. And if you look at it, the proportion, even in, like I have just put a snapshot of India's performance, even in that you will find that despite coming third in the list of countries, India's 11 policies, 73 of them are gender blind. So that is the status that comes to when it is on how we are performing on health. Next slide, please. And the next is to have a gender responsive employment. So here again, the McKinsey's report came about on various scenarios. If we were allowed to allow the current trend to continue, and if we were to do nothing, then by 2030, we are going to experience a -1 trillion of global economy. But if we try to address some of the gender inequalities that were there, at least mildly, at least to some extent, then we stand to gain at least about $8 trillion dollars. But if we were actually going to start acting right now and not wait until the pandemic is over, then we can estimate at least about $13 trillion dollars added to our economy. So it says, like, even, and if you look at it, the gender parity, to move the needle from just by 0.06 could have this enormous impact. So that is what they argue to. Even if if we were to start policies immediately after the pandemic is over, we still stand to gain. And next, please. So the last bit is on the gender, to have a gender responsive social re-engineering, where governments would need to aggressively try to address inequalities among women itself. There's entrenched parochial customs, regressive norms, prejudiced traditions, which have placed women in an unequal position within society. And centuries of socioeconomic and cultural constructs have been used to explain and understand the violence against women and persisting inequality between them and men. However, very little attention is paid to addressing the inequality among women perpetrated through the same social norms, caste structures, and the rural-urban divide. Even the SDGs call for an end to inequality. Unfortunately, the focus has remained strictly to inequality between the sexes and not between the gender itself. So this definitely has to change. Next slide. Conclusions. So to recap, I have 5 key takeaways that I have is: South Asia is not on track to achieve gender equality by 2020. Women's jobs and livelihoods are more vulnerable to pandemic effects. COVID-19 and lockdown increased violence against women worldwide. Women's low representation in decision-making levels impedes their participation in social dialogue, collective bargaining, and policy development. And social and economic costs of continuing inequality is simply too high. So the final point is COVID-19 has increased some pre-existing inequalities, inequalities between men and women, inequalities among women, and it's also increased inequalities among children. Why do these inequalities matter? Because unlike the inequalities between the rich and the poor, the vertical inequality, this horizontal inequality, which the UN World Bank report a couple of years clearly suggests, is a trigger for conflict, much more than vertical inequality. And at the core of horizontal inequality is the threat to human security, where the poor and vulnerable define their security and poverty in multidimensional ways that encompass self-respect, autonomy, access to land, and so on, and not just income alone. So therefore, there is an urgent need to usher in a gender-responsive social health and economic policy to rebuild the region with the fastest growing demography and youth bulge in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Malika. We will now hear from Ms. Michelle Andrina, who will present on the assessment of socioeconomic impact of COVID-19 pandemic on households in Indonesia. Ms. Michelle, if you please.
So thank you, Dr. Tamara, and it's an honor to be able to join this panel with Dr. Malika, Dr. Jyoti, and Ms. Margaret. So, ladies and gentlemen, can you allow me to begin this presentation with a short story of Ibu Melati? She is one of the informant we met in North Jakarta in October 2020. So at the beginning of the pandemic, Ibu Melati lost her job as a domestic maid, and her son is also lost his job in a restaurant after being laid off. And despite the side job her son finally landed, the income was still not enough to afford food for the 3 members of her family. When telling us her story, Ibu Melati said that her daughter, who was still schooling, she frequently cried from hunger, and as a result, she found it to concentrate while studying from home. And I tried to quote what Ibu Melati said to calm her daughter. "You are now old enough. You are almost hit 12. You should stand your hunger. You are not going to die." And Ibu Melati was extremely happy when her family received the staple food assistance from the government for 4 months. However, since September, she did not receive any assistance anymore. She also had to move to another place for failing to pay for the house rent. So The story of Ibu Melati, it reflects the basic message that I'm trying to tell you through the presentation of mine today. Many are gravely affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and social assistance, they have helped in ease the community burden. However, we know that the crisis is not over yet so far. Thus, the assistance is still need to be distributed upon careful consideration of their distribution. And next. So this study is a breakthrough of inter-institution collaboration of UNICEF, UNDP, Prospera, and the Semeru Research Institute. And we aim to help provide better policy information for the government. The survey, it was conducted in October and November, and it involved more than 12,000 households in all provinces in Indonesia. So the survey represents all households at the national level. So far, this is the largest survey on the COVID impact in Indonesia, and it focused on children and vulnerable groups. The data were collected using face-to-face interview with the same household previously interviewed by the Statistic Indonesia in 2019. The number I am about to present in the next 15 minutes provide the real picture of what happened in the entire nation. Thus, in today's presentation, I will try to talk about the numbers along with the story behind them. Next. The study has some main findings, and I will divide them into three main parts. The first one, I will discuss the impact on the COVID-19. And then second, I will talk about the social assistance covered. And finally, I will explain the policy recommendation. Next. So first, the survey confirmed that all we all know that this COVID-19 pandemic, indeed, it severely affects household finance, and it's likely continue in 2021. First, we find that 3 in 4 households, they face reduced income, particularly for households with children and those in urban area. Second, we also find that a small proportion, 14% of my breadwinner, they switch job as a result of the pandemic. Yet, among those, half of them, they switch from formal to informal employment. And third, from the survey, we also know that half of households in Indonesia, they have no saving at all. And in order to survive, 1 of 3 of households, they have to sell or pawn their asset, and a quarter of them borrow money informally from relatives or colleagues. And fourth, we also find that 1/3 of all households, they own business, and almost all, 90% of them, admitted that they have a hard time due to the pandemic. The hardest one is the decrease in buyer, which eventually result in a decreased income. Next. Yeah, children are missing out. So, well, we know that children is not being the face of this pandemic because they are relatively affected from the virus, but children actually lost many things during the pandemic, like Bu Malika said earlier. And I would like to highlight 4 dimensions which affect children welfare during the pandemic. The first dimension is the income. Around 3/4 of households with children, they face reduced income, and its implication, children poverty might increase. UNICEF predict that over 2 million children in Indonesia, they will be poor if the social assistance to household is discontinued in 2021. And second, we also have frequently heard the risk of learning loss in our children because schools have been closed in March and children have to learn from home. Learning from home is mostly online until now. However, access to stable internet is still a main issue that children have to deal with the learning from home. Rural and poor households, they encounter more problems with the internet and the limited ownership of gadgets than children in urban areas and from richer families. Third, in the term of health, 40% of parents, they admitted that they were worried their children will contract COVID. And 13% of households with children under 5, they cannot access the immunization service. Additionally, school closure, social isolation, and combined with economic uncertainty, they also put children to other risks. The survey find that 45% of households, they report behavior challenges among their children. We also find an increased number of working children. Next. Another issue we monitored in this survey is whether or not the COVID affect the household food consumption, and if it does, to what extent is the impact. So we employ a measurement developed by FAO, namely the Food Insecurity Experience Scale, or FIES, to answer this question. So the FIES has 8 questions, and they are used to measure the food insecurity level, starting from mild ones, such as being worried if they cannot afford to eat, moderate, such as they skipping meal or eating less, and also severe, such as having nothing to eat throughout the day. Based on the Statistic Indonesia calculation in 2019, prior to the pandemic, on quote unquote, only 5.4% of households that have moderate and severe food insecurity. Yet in 2020, this number increased to over two-folds. It increased to 11.7. It means that 10 or 11 in 100 households have to deal with food insecurity issue. Next. And this pandemic, yeah, it's same with what Malika said earlier, the pandemic also increased women's workload. We all know that most women, they are burdened with domestic work, and some women also have to work and contribute to their family income. So while school, daycare, kindergarten are closed, this mother also have to help their children learning from home. We find that 71.5% of households with children of schooling age, they are helped by their mother during the distant learning, yet only 23% of them are helped by their fathers. So this is surely a large discrepancy. One of the mothers we interviewed said that she is in the emotional wreck in the morning. Next. And households with members with disability, they are also affected. 9 in 10 households with members with mild disability, they have decrease in income. 1 in 10 lost their job. The access to therapy to service also disrupted for 1 of 3 households with children with disabilities, and one of 3 households were members with severe disabilities. So what do this number actually tell? I want to share a story of Ibu Kasih, whose home is 3 hours to the hospital. Ibu Kasih has a child with abnormal foot bone, who could have been treated with regular therapy. However, Ibu Kasih postponed her child therapy at the hospital because she was afraid of getting infected with the COVID-19. After some months with no therapy, she noticed that her child's legs were getting weaker. Her child found it is hard to walk and complained that it was very painful. Next. So with this problem, we noticed that this pandemic triggers another health issue. 17% of household head and 16% of their spouse are mentally pressured and overly anxious. Most of them say that this stem from the economic issue, and half of them were concerned they might be infected by COVID. Children are also stressed. 20% of households with children noticed that it was difficult for their children to concentrate, and some could be easily angry, sad, and insomniac. We might think that these children probably are behaving, quote unquote, like any kid. However, actually throughout the world, mental health is called the silent pandemic. And the surveys show that this is also an issue in need to attention in Indonesia and in other countries too. Next. So far we have discussed the impact, and the government of Indonesia already introduced massive fiscal stimulus package. So in this study, we also asked households if they receive any assistance, and what they receive, and how it's helpful for them. So next. Yeah, our main finding is that social assistance, they have currently covered many people in need. So most households, 95%, they receive at least one form of social assistance, be it cash or in-kind one. Half of the total household, they receive cash assistance, and the poorest, they receive the most. Yet there are still room for improvements. This means targeting issues still exist, particularly in the exclusion error. More than 1/3 of the 40% poorest household, they do not receive cash assistance. And this includes the poor household with children and poor household in urban areas. Next. We also figure out that many programs are designed to complement each other to overcome the various hurdles many families are currently facing, such as the electricity bill subsidy to help people learn and work from home, staple assistance to help households provide meals on table, and cash to give people more flexibility to decide what they could spend their money on. I will not go into detail, but the diagram on the left, it shows that those receiving cash assistance, they also receive other support. Next. And yeah, I have said earlier that 1 in 3 households on their own business, and most of them are affected by the pandemic. And as we all already know, women play the main role in family business. So the survey result indicates that women-owned business are mostly concentrated on trade, restaurant, and accommodation sector. And this sector is the one that was hit hardest by the social distancing policy. The percentage of business which have to close down temporarily is greater in business owned by women, up to 7%, than those owned by women are collectively owned. However, we find that only few households 7.5% that it already received assistance for business from the government when the survey was conducted in October and November. Next. So what the beneficiary have to say about it, and in general the response are fairly positive, and they also prefer to have the assistance in cash. Next. This is our strategic recommendation, and this is not specifically intended for only government of Indonesia, but also for many development partners, NGO, and the general public attending this event to help us get out of this pandemic. Okay, so the first, we need to give better support to children through learning, social protection, health, nutrition, and child protection. We need to support the school to gradually opening to ensure that cash transfer program are helpful to the affected household with children. And also we have to prioritize the delivery of life-saving vaccine and medicine to protect children from disease. Next. Yeah, second, we also need to expand the food assistance and combat supply disruption to deal with the increased food insecurity. We also need to pay attention to the middle-low income group who are currently poorer and more vulnerable, and that they need to be constantly assisted through a set of programs. For policy and programs, they also need to be more focused on continuing the assistance to household owning business to be able to help them recover. And then we also need to lessen women care work by reopening school gradually and safely. We have to organize campaign for promoting equal distribution of care work at home and equip parents with skill and support that they need to be able to support their children in the transition from learning from home to learning from school. We also need to ensure that people with disability, they can access the health service and treatment that they need. Next. Lastly, we also have two main recommendations to improve the distribution of social assistance. The first one is that the government need to promote better knowledge of government support by developing user-friendly medium with up-to-date information on assistance. And the second, we recommend that the government, they connect the new registration social assistance for single database for the targeting in the future. So yeah, this is all the analysis in the number answers that I can share in this occasion. And I'd like to give it back to Dr. Nair. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Michelle. Thank you for your presentation on your field data that you have presented. Very interesting findings indeed. And we are on a roll. Both of you have done it within the 15 minutes. So the pressure is on Dr. Jyoti and Margaret. So we will hear from Dr. Jyoti now. And her presentation is on environment, sustainable and inclusive growth, women issues in South Asia. Dr. Jyoti, if you please.
I would like to thank the organizers of the 5th NTS-Asia Consortium Annual Conference for having given me this opportunity to speak on a very pertinent topic, and that is environment, sustainable and inclusive growth, women issues in South Asia. I have divided my presentation into 3 parts. First, I'm going to talk about the characteristics of the women in South Asian region. Then I'm going to talk about the various issues and challenges that the women in South Asia face, and how to overcome those challenges. I would suggest certain recommendations. So coming to the first part, characteristics. Broadly speaking, one can say that the women in South Asia have a predefined role as caregivers. This is what makes it difficult for the women to embrace their entrepreneurial nature. Research indicates that the women in South Asia lack the political and social economic support which could enhance their entrepreneurial skills. Lack of education, legislations, even at times financial support systems, and of course, the climate-induced constraints make the gender roles more oppressive and more unequal. COVID-19 times have seen that women have come out with innovative and resilient approach towards the pandemic. They have not only adapted, they have adopted, with showcasing their will to survive and optimism towards future. The UNEP report, which I'm quoting, does not give a very encouraging picture, and it says that the women are discouraged from learning coping strategies and life-saving skills, especially related to the climate risk-related disasters. Times of floods, droughts, famine, they disrupt the social safety nets leaving women and children most vulnerable, and examples are human trafficking. So women entrepreneurship in South Asia is still a distant dream. However, the micro businesses have become alternative for women during COVID time. And mind you, it is the MSMEs which have suffered the maximum blow also. Now, what are the issues and challenges that the women in South Asia are facing in COVID or pre-COVID times? Well, again, I have structured the issues and challenges into three basic broad framework. First, I'm going to talk about the structural constraint, the systemic constraint, and cultural and societal constraint. Now, the division is not clearly demarcated as it is in the slide. There is certainly an intermission and interwoven in all the three challenges and issues that I talk about. Structural change, of course, lack of infrastructure, education opportunities. In systemic, you see the climate-induced changes, constraints, governance issues. And in cultural and societal, the social marginalization of the women of South Asia with restrictions and taboos. As I told you, the interconnectedness of the issue remains, and one cannot define them or delineate them as per the divisions stated earlier. So what are the structural changes? I'm going to take two case studies, one of a government-sponsored initiative and the other of a non-government sponsored initiative. So the Nai Manzil initiative actually was started by the Ministry of Minority Affairs of India. In fact, both the case studies are from India. Today, the World Bank is supporting this by giving it a loan of 50 million US dollars. So what is this Nai Manzil about? Nai Manzil, if you translate it into English, means new destination. So all the school dropouts from the minority communities, they are given a second chance by giving us 6 months of education, training, skilling, and further 6 months of support to establish themselves. So much so that one of the beneficiaries of the system is Samira, whom you see on your screen. She was just 14 years old, a dropout, and her impoverished parents made her marry someone from the fishing community in Kerala's Malappuram district. She started a bismal tailoring home-based venture with the assistance from the India's Ministry of Minority Affairs. Post-lockdown, she received several orders for masks which kept her family afloat during the crisis. Today, 50,700 minority women, especially from the same community, have benefited from education and training provided by this program. The second case study is Vidya. Vidya is again from a small town in Satara in Maharashtra. She was facing financial crunch and financial turmoil when she decided to step out of her caregiving role. And in fact, she started her business of handmade stitching bags with the support of an NGO called Mandeshri. It's a foundation which supports women enterprises. So she was given a loan of 50,000, which sustained herself, not only herself, she gave 7 members of her family, took them as staff to stitching these masks. And today she's even using digital and financial literacy skills like WhatsApp, Facebook, and her entrepreneurship today is a registered MSME. Next, we talk about, so these are some of her traditional handmade bags, from traditional handmade bags to the face masks, which she has started taking. Moving from small cities, small places and villages and towns to big cities. Ayanti Gurusinghe, she is from Sri Lanka, founder and managing director of core360.com. It's purely an e-commerce trading platform, and she connects the entrepreneurs and startups with global buyers and sellers. So the international market has trade products not only across Sri Lanka, but also India and Pakistan. So she helps women entrepreneurs with technology, branding, and communication skills. So women play a much stronger role than men in management of ecosystem and food security. So when I talk about ecosystems and services and food security, I'm primarily, again, referring to my second constraint or the second issue and challenge, and that is systemic challenges. So climate vulnerability is going to be one of very important and pertinent issues, which is going to be in fact, part of our system now, and we need to showcase it to everybody. Now, if you can see this here, if you see the vulnerability of human population in the South Asian region, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Pakistan, even Afghanistan, you see the maroon, the reddish part. These are the regions in the next 30 years which are going to be most vulnerable. So what do? There are some women in Bangladesh who have taken to environment-friendly initiatives. Yes, the problem was faced by Bangladeshi farmers. There is a plant by the name of water hyacinth, and it blocks the canals that irrigates the agricultural land. Now look at the ingenuity of these women who are located in a small remote place of Gaibandha. They have turned this problem into profit. Why do I say that? Because, they dried the plant, the water hyacinth flower, and they have weaved them into fancy home decors, vases, flower mats, baskets, and today there's a growing demand not only at home but abroad, exported to the US. So it certainly is a matter of pride for the small community of women who are turning their problem into profit. Next, I'm going to talk about another environmentally sustained enterprise, and this is by the name Fool.company, which is based in Kanpur, India. So I'd like to show you a video which is going to take you through the enterprise.
India produces tons of flower waste every day. But now, giving a second life to these sacred flowers, collecting more than 12 tons of them from temples and transforming them into handmade incense sticks. But can this blossoming startup make an impact on India's flower waste problem? We visited the headquarters of Fool in Kanpur to find out. It all starts in bustling wholesale markets like the one in Shivalaya. Merchants pick up the flowers that they'll sell outside Hindu temples. Because these flowers are used in rituals, they're considered sacred and can't be thrown into the garbage. Every day, more than 1,000 tons of flowers end up in the Ganges River. But many contain toxic chemicals like arsenic, lead, and cadmium, as well as pesticides.
I have been seeing people putting flowers in the water all my life, but never before had anyone questioned temple waste as a source of pollution. The seed was sown.
Ankit founded Fool, which is the Hindi word for flower. The company's employees pick up the waste from temples throughout Kanpur, making around 19 stops a day. Then they transport the flowers to Fool's facility, where they weigh and separate them from thread, fabric, and plastic. Workers save only the flower petals for the incense sticks and sort them by color. They keep the buds and stems to create compost that is sold as a separate product. Then they lay the flower petals out to dry on large tarps. Once they're dry, they grind them into a powder that is mixed by hand with water and essential oils until it reaches a clay-like texture. Then it's time to roll. Workers dip their fingers into the flour powder while rolling to create an even thickness. Then they let the sticks dry before dipping them again in essential oils. They're laid out to dry one more time, then packaged up. Workers here can produce around 400 incense sticks every hour. Ankit calls this transformation flower cycling, and he says his product is cleaner than others.
Normally, incense sticks are made from charcoal. Burning charcoal releases the poisonous sulfur dioxide and gives out a lot of xylene chemicals.
So that brings me to my third part of constraint, which is societal and cultural challenges. Needless to say that the video I showed, the women are the maximum beneficiaries of that entrepreneurial environment sustainable enterprise. And they are tackling pollution in Ganges and giving local women employment. So coming to the societal and cultural constraints which the women in South Asia face, Social marginalization, as I said, was one of the very important reasons, and education, which has time and again been pointed out by the previous presenters. I'm going to take a case study of Pakistan, where half of the Pakistani women do not attend school, and only 10% women have post-secondary education. But look at this lady, Ramla Qureshi. She's a civil engineer of Pakistan, specializing in structural and earthquake engineering, founder of Women Engineer Pakistan, and she, in fact, is trying to mitigate the gender gap in STEM. Another lady by the name of Maheen Adamji, when COVID-19 shut primary schools throughout Pakistan in early 2020, she changed her business, formed a home tutoring e-commerce institution or e-commerce enterprise by the name Dot and Line. And she used her homes as teaching skills and also involved other women micro-franchisees. So she expanded now into several countries, primarily because of the demand of the diaspora from Pakistan in other countries. So her response to COVID-19 was not only with agility, but creativity and resilience. Now, breaking gender-based stereotype, I'm going to take you to Nepal. Kamala is one amongst the 200 to 300 mobile women masons who make up today 20% of the mobile masonry teams, which is an unprecedented feat, as masonry and construction sector is conventionally being male-dominated in Nepal. Prior to the 2015 earthquake, women participation was primarily in the labor work. But today, things have changed. This is one of the more slide of women mason breaking this gender barrier. Another lady, she is known to address inequality in Nepal, and she has earned respect in her municipality. She says her priority is the marginalized people in her municipality. In fact, the influx of Nepali migrant workers returning from India had exacerbated the pre-existing discrimination against the Dalit community. And she warned that if anybody discriminated against the Dalits, she would report them to the police. So she, in her own way, is acting for the community, the marginalized community. So after these issues and challenges, if I may ask, what can we recommend to address these issues and challenges faced by South Asian women? First of all, invest in gender sensitive and culturally appropriate labor saving green technologies, which could be like water harvesting, it could be like storage, irrigation systems, and even substitutes for fuel woods. We must focus on women's needs and livelihood, increase their access to education, which should be a priority, and also reproductive health services. One needs to ensure an enabling environment so that women actively participate not only in governance, but leadership and technical skills. The textbook should show women in varied roles. There should be safer public spaces, proper legislation for effective implementation of laws on sexual harassment and violence against women. We need to increase the participation and take the substantive inputs of women in not only decision making, but also in policy making. Apart from the government, the NGOs must be encouraged and local voluntary organizations also to form self-help groups to help women. So apart from few women-led enterprises, environmental, sustainable, and inclusive growth for women in South Asia remains a challenge, and it needs to be addressed at the earliest. Women are often in the front line in respect to the impacts of climate change. Globally, the world is seeing increasingly frequent droughts and floods, which are having not only economic, but profound social consequences. So the women and people of Asia are currently at the greatest risk, with over 100 million people affected in this region annually. So it is time to act now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thank you so much, Dr. Jyoti. Much of your recommendation can be implemented in developed countries as well around the world, not only in South Asia in that sense. And your presentation is a nice segue into our final presentation for the day, which is Ms. Margaret Zinberen's discussion on rethinking crisis, inequality, and sustainability. Margaret, if you please.
A very good day to all. I will present today my observations on crisis, inequality, and sustainability, and how our thinking on these issues may need to be reshaped. Next, please. Now, the experience of the current pandemic crisis has shown us that the various systems that the society has put in place may not be completely foolproof after all, that the real test of the system's robustness may come only when the real crisis happens. While the COVID-19 pandemic might have come as a surprise, potential climate crisis has been studied and projected for a number of years. And there are a lot we can learn from the current public health emergency to avert future climate crises. There are multiple attempts at explaining why the current pandemic happened. One of them is through the planetary health lens, which holds that there is a connection between human health and the health of the natural systems or the environment. This perspective maintains that human health and human civilization depend on the flourishing natural systems and the care of the ecosystems. This view then suggests that the current COVID-19 pandemic happened because the natural environment is damaged. The focus on the health of the natural environment as a precondition of human health and civilization thus calls for the respect of the integrity of natural systems as an integral part of the definition of human prosperity. Next. The emphasis on the natural systems or the earth systems coincides with some observations that strongly suggest that climate change is not only about carbon emissions resulting from the use of fossil fuels, but also correlates strongly with the consumption of the earth's resources that drives the workings of the global economy. For example, a study finds that emissions embedded in international trade increased from year 1990 to 2008, and the increased emissions in most developed countries came from the consumption of imported products compared to the emissions produced in their own territories. Next. Similarly, another study that looks into emission trends in different sectors finds that although the UK and the EU as a whole have reduced their emissions in the electricity, gas, and water sector between 1990 and 2011, as you can see there highlighted in blue, the import of products in the same sector had actually had similar, if not more emissions embedded in them. So this implies that rather than actually reducing their carbon footprint for these sectors, it has grown and moved abroad. Next. A more recent study confirms these observations and show that consumption of commodities such as beef and soybean in many developed countries induces more deforestation abroad than domestically. In fact, commodity consumption in Japan, Germany, France, the UK, and Italy have 91 to 99% of their deforestation footprints in foreign countries. And as we all know, deforestation is strongly linked to climate change. Next. Now, having observed this connection between carbon emissions and consumption, particularly in relation to international trade, I would like to show how these are all linked to inequality. In this chart, we see the proportion of carbon emissions generated in different countries in year 2016. The top 10 countries, if you see there, it's the proportion of the circle colored in orange, produced more than 68% of global emissions, with China, United States, and the EU combined making up of close to 47% of global emissions. Now, while this is a common chart that most of us would refer to when we speak of carbon emissions, there is probably a little less known graph that would help bridge what we discussed earlier about emissions and consumption and this country-based emissions chart. Next. In this graph here, which shows, in this graph here, we see when the Earth's resources will start to exceed what the Earth can regenerate in that particular year. It is called country overshoot days. Now we read this graph clockwise. I know it's rather small, so I'm just going to give you a very brief observation about this chart. Now we can see that generally developed countries are on the right-hand side of this chart, whereas developing countries are on the left-hand side. It shows that if the whole population on Earth consume the Earth's resources like the population in developed countries, then the date on which the Earth's regeneration limit will be crossed will occur earlier in that year. For example, here we see that in year 2020, resource consumption would have trespassed the Earth's regeneration threshold on 11 February if everyone consumed resources like the population in Qatar. On 14th March, if everyone consumed resources like the population in the US, and on 11th of April, if everyone consumed resources like the population in Singapore. But the date will be shifted much later if the world consumed resources like population in developing countries. For example, on October 8th, if everyone consumed resources like the population in Vietnam, and on December 18th, if everyone consumed resources like the population in Indonesia. This chart, therefore, represents inequality in resource consumption, which is also reflected in equality in carbon emissions that we will see in the next slide. Next. Here we see what the author of this particular study refers to as the champagne glass of global carbon inequality. It shows how little things have changed between year 1990 and 2015, in which the richest 10% in the world were responsible for around 50% of global emissions, the middle 40% for around 40% of global emission, and the remaining poor 50% of global population emitting less than 10% of carbon. Next. This chart here shows more clearly the proportion of carbon emissions based on income levels in 2015. Top 10% income earner, middle 40% income earner, and bottom 50% income earner. Look at the bar in red. It is how much carbon is emitted by the top 1% income earner alone. Next. So where are the richest 10% and middle 40% residing in this world? Now this graph here shows that around 25% of them live in China, 21% in North America, and 14% in Europe. Does this ring a bell? Yes, this is exactly the same composition we saw earlier in the chart showing country-based carbon emissions. Next. Now, at this junction, this observation suggests that increasing wealth correlates with increasing resource consumption and also increasing carbon emissions. We can see how this can be problematic because it will mean ever-increasing resource consumption and carbon emissions as developing countries try to grow their economies, get part of their population out of poverty, and increase the wealth and prosperity of their population. In practical terms, these graphs here show how economic development in the Southeast Asian countries had affected the Earth between the year 1981 and 2016. You see there Brunei Darussalam on top left, Indonesia comes next, and all the way to Vietnam at bottom right. The green portion represents biocapacity, which is the Earth's capacity to produce resources and absorb waste material generated by humans. And the red color shows ecological deficit, which occurs when the footprint of population exceeds the biocapacity. And we can see the trends there. We can see that all Southeast Asian countries had crossed their biocapacity limits, and the red portion had been growing bigger and bigger over the years. Next. The case for a stronger focus on the Earth system is further supported by a study that shows that 4 out of 9 planetary boundaries, which define safe operating space within which humanity can continue to develop and thrive for generations to come, have been crossed. As you can see in this chart, the 4 planetary boundaries in question are the ones in red and yellow, and they are climate change, genetic diversity, land system change, and biochemical flows. The researchers of this particular study suggest that crossing these boundaries increases the risk of generating large-scale, abrupt, or irreversible environmental changes. Now, next. What do all this suggest then? Well, for one, there is an urgent need to move beyond a heavy focus on renewable energy development when it comes to climate discussion. A more holistic approach is imperative if we were to avert climate crisis and its attendant impact on human lives. A rethinking along the line of crisis, inequality, and sustainability has pointed to the need to addressing the root causes of the problem by looking at the Earth itself. And this necessarily begs the question of whether the current consumption-based economic development model can truly be sustainable, or is it time to craft an alternative economic growth model that depends less on consumption? With that, I end my presentation. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Margaret, for your presentation. We will now be taking questions. So if you could just use the chat box to ask your questions. And if you could just indicate who you're addressing the question to, or whether you'd like the whole panel to take your question. I'll just give you a minute to have that done. But in the meantime, let me just start off with the first question for the speakers, and anyone can take this question. Now, all the speakers have spoken about sort of intersectionality. So you don't just talk about inequalities, very specifically about class, but also even within, for example, Ms. Michelle, you talked about where you talk in terms of children, you have inequalities within children, you know, in a particular area, or even when we speak in terms of women and vulnerable groups. How would you, what type of information would you need for policymakers to actually sort of get that intersectionality in policies for crisis, for example, like the ones that we are going through now? So it's not just about looking at class, it's not just about looking at gender, it's actually looking at within class and within gender. Or is it even possible to address, you know, the intersectionalities within each of these groups? Perhaps I can start with Dr. Malika first, and then we will go down.
Yeah, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the study that we did on SDGs, I think SDGs is a great framework to monitor and assess how each of the countries are doing, and specifically on data, because most of their targets and indicators is based on the data that they already have. And one of the suggestions that we have made is how we can create more gender-related targets and indicators across other goals as well, not just the ones which have been specifically suggested by the global template. So for things like education, we already have data, gender aggregated data on rural, urban, and we also have on crime, we have against particular communities, minorities. So maybe if India could go ahead and include them as additional indicators, additional targets, I think that's a great way of looking at where they are right now and see how the gap of inequality between women can be addressed over a period of time, rather than only looking at between the sexes. So I think data is available, and using an SDG framework, I think it's they're already on board doing it. I think it will be a great way to go forward.
Thank you. Ms. Michelle?
Yeah, thank you, Doctor. So related to what the question about the policymaker needs, and so we are closely working together with the Ministry of Finance and also the Ministry of Planning and Statistics Indonesia. And the one thing that they really want to know, other than these findings, is where is the household? They need the information in detail, if it's possible, to the level of province or even in the district. So that is what they need, because in Indonesia we have the decentralization system of government. So the central government, they can allocate, but to a certain point, they need the data to know to where they should allocate more. That's from me.
Thank you very much. Dr. Jyoti, please.
Thank you, Chair. So, that's a very pertinent question. And as I told in my presentation, there needs to be intermission of structural constraints, of systemic constraints, and issues and challenges of societal and cultural issues. I would like to just give you one example. As Malika said, SDGs should be the broad framework in which all the countries in South Asia should work. But I have a little problem in this. And the problem is that SDGs, when they come up with big policy making, it is in the overall policy scenario. I think we need more ground-based policies where the policies trickle from the ground to the top rather from top to down. And that is where the gap lies. For instance, in Bangladesh, the women do not face problems which the women in Nepal or India face. And why do I say that? I have data with me which says that in Bangladesh, the climate-induced vulnerabilities of women are more than any other. The gender inequalities in Bangladesh have highlighted this unequal power relationship. In fact, greater number of women experience poverty related to climate hazards. In fact, the whole dichotomy between man versus women dichotomy in climate change studies is based in Bangladesh. Not only socially constructed taboos are hindrances for the women in Bangladesh, but also climate. Human trafficking is one of the reasons. Children and women are the most vulnerable sector. And if I may just reiterate again that the map I showed you showed that Bangladesh was completely submerged with the maroon color, which means next 30 years we need to uptake this very, very seriously. And until and unless we understand the interwoven factors of all the three issues and constraints that I mentioned, I do not think SDGs can also play a great role until and unless they understand the nitty-gritty of the grassroots, the ground-based problems. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much. And I completely agree with you with the bottom-up approach in terms of policies. We do have a few questions. Margaret, this question that I just asked may not directly be relevant to your presentation. So if you don't mind, we will go to some of the questions that have actually come for the panel. So the first one is for everyone, actually. So the question is, in your policy work, where is it targeted? And is it with a particular ministry, or is it intersectoral or at the subnational or local level? Okay, that's for everyone. And I have one more question here, also addressed to all speakers. Is COVID stalling or accelerating the shift towards a more fair workforce as far as gender is concerned? So those are the two questions. Yes, Dr. Jyoti, you had something?
Yeah, coming to the second question first, there's a report by the Oxfam India, which has estimated an economic loss of nearly $216 billion for the women losing their jobs during the pandemic. And, so to answer that question, I do not see in the foreseeable future post-lockdown that there is going to be enough of there's going to be aggravation of gender inequalities in South Asia at least. And let me again tell you the MSMEs, which are reflected in my presentation. This sector comprises 69 million enterprises, the MSME sector in India, and approximately 110 million of the national workforce. This is the second largest generator of employment after agriculture in India. And where have we reached? 90% of female entrepreneurs have reported significant decrease in their sales revenue, and at least 40% women have reported losing their jobs post-lockdown. So with these data in mind, there is certainly low level of profit, lesser chances of finding employment, and higher rate of unpaid and domestic work. So the recovery of women-led MSEs certainly is going to be slower than any. So the gap is just going to increase and widen up.
Thank you. Can I just direct the same question? Is COVID stalling or accelerating the shift towards a more fair workforce as far as gender is concerned? To Ms. Michelle and Dr. Malika, please. Michelle, if you will.
Probably Dr. Malika first, because
Okay, sure.
Okay, it's already
Dr.
silent,
Malika,
sorry.
please. No problem. Yes.
Okay. So,
Dr. Malika, if you don't mind, yeah.
No. I think it's going to have a severe impact, and many of those women who have lost their jobs, most of the reports indicate that they're not going to get it back, because I think there is also a equal or more pressure to tend to a household duties. And I said in India, it's already gone up by 30% from what they were already doing. And what they were already doing was more than about 250 hours 250 minutes per day, compared to about 30 minutes per day what the men were doing. So this is like increased phenomenally, and I don't think that many of them are going to go back. And this is at the background of where the female labor participation rate has been steadily decreasing. So if you ask me, I don't think we are going to see greater gender parity coming in, at least in the economic participation. I think it's going to take a while, which is why I think McKinsey and the other major reports stress that at least after the COVID, please do something to get them back to work. Otherwise, we are looking at huge losses. And can I also take a moment to address the SDGs, which is being talked about? Because SDGs, yes, it's a global framework, and every country has been requested to localize them. And in India's case, it's been localized to the Gram Panchayat level, meaning the indicators for performance is at a very local and grassroots level to how they measure the success of particular goals. And that is happening all across South Asia. So unlike what we would assume that it's only at a very macro level, no, it's happening at a very micro grassroots level.
Thank you. Michelle, actually, you may choose to respond to that question, or I have another question that's directly for you. Would you like to take that?
I think I will answer it quickly. So
yes, sure.
Based on the survey, we found that both female and the male primary earner, they experience roughly similar level of job loss of 7%. It's similar to job loss, but the women, they have more informal jobs than men. And they also have another issue with the double burden. They have to take care of children at home too. So although we also found that women, they are start taking business because of the pandemic to provide more additional income, but I'm not sure it is a decent work one or it is a formal one. It's more like informal, so I'm not sure it will be create more gender balance in the workforce.
Sure. There is one question directly for you. I'm just going to ask you that. So it says, actually, it was for everyone, but then they've said it's for you. So in your policy work, where is it targeted? Is it with a particular ministry, or is it intersectoral, or at the subnational or local level?
So in this work, we targeted the Ministry of Finance because they are the one that do the planning for the social assistance, and also the Ministry of Planning. We also try to approach the Ministry of Social Affairs, but they're just a new minister, and it's hard to approach the new minister within this given short time.
Thank you. Margaret, not to make you feel left out, there is a question for you. Okay, this is specifically for you, Margaret. You spoke about the paradigm shift in the economic development model, but yes, is it not also important to address the issue of who determines the climate change mitigation agenda, who suggests alternatives, and which alternatives are considered? For example, Bhutan developed the happiness index more than a decade ago, but global community showed little interest.
Okay, thank you, Tamara, and thank you, Seema, for that very, very relevant and interesting question, because those are also my questions all this time. Well, I mean, I think we all know that the current global economic system is primarily a product of a post-1945 war. And the current functioning of the economy is obviously being supported by the major economies in the world who also happen to be the major powers in the world. And it is not surprising that then climate change and mitigation agenda is very much shaped and influenced by them. and also are being supported by the global international organizations, including the UN and all. But I think in recent times, if not very, very recent months, there has been some shift also in the thinking of those in the position of power, because they've begun to see that these issues of resource consumption and depletion can no longer be set aside in the name of simply growing the economies. It can no longer be sustainable. So if we look at the reports, for example, that came from the UK Climate Commission just very recently in December last year, there has been a stronger emphasis also on resource consumption, for example. And also there has been talks among Scandinavian countries to call for multilateral cooperation to actually focus on these issues too. But I do agree that it may not be as how to say, as speedy as people would like changes to come about. And I do agree that a happiness index is very important because it shifts the emphasis on a material pursuit of things as part of the definition of prosperity and happiness. And I think there are also a group of people, particularly in Europe, who have also been developing a happiness index that is less strong on material pursuit or even like income generation and stuff like that. So things are on the works, moving, but I do agree with you that in the end of the day, these alternative perspectives on how the economy needs to be reshaped need to gain greater attention from those people in positions of power. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. There is a question, and this is addressed to everyone. What are the strategies to make governments listen? What about polities where there is a democratic deficit, and who listens to whom, and why do they do it? Can we start with Dr. Malika, and then Ms. Michelle, and then Dr. Jyoti, and then Margaret? Dr. Malika, please.
Yeah. So the question on democratic deficit, I think while working with GPAC earlier, what we found was the positive role civil society can play to try and wrestle some space for itself to work on this and use regional organizations, regional mechanisms as a strategic backyard when dealing with countries which are particularly facing democratic deficit. So those could be like regional forums or something where these issues could be addressed. International forums, yes, but then the local context specificity goes away when you're talking at a very global level. But this is something which has been flagged as an issue across the globe on democratic deficit and shrinking civic space. So that language could be used, but something that needs to be engaged at a local level, at a regional level with regional intergovernmental organizations to see if they can pick it up as something that they can talk about.
Thank you. Ms. Michelle?
Yeah, so we do a series of policy engagements till the design of the study. And when we start with the training of enumerator, we involve them. When we find the first findings, the primary one, we also deliver to them. So it is a back and forth policy engagement. So they're really happy. The Ministry of Finance, particularly, they're really happy with our results, and that's why when after we finally present our final finding, and yeah, in the next weeks they decide that they will continue the social assistance in 2021. So I think it is an effort of back and forth policy engagement. So the government will see that they are the partners in this study, and it is for the better of Indonesia.
Thank you. Dr. Jyoti?
Yeah, I think it has been covered very well. I would just like to add one thing, that the democratic deficit reflects the governance issue. And until and unless we address the poor governance issues, the democratic deficit will always remain, be it India, be it Nepal, be it any other country in South Asia. So we have to actually look and address the governance issue. And with regard to the government, there in India, there is India's Ministry of Minority Affairs, and I gave a case study of Naeem Manzil, that how this particular ministry has, totally, there's been a paradigm shift of the minority communities in India, especially with regard to this example that I gave, wherein the government did step in, gave funding, and so much so that now it is the World Bank also has stepped in, and it's giving almost 50 billion US dollars to project this fund. So I think, again, the initiative has to not only be from top, but also from ground. And the governance, lack of governance is something which will address the democratic deficit. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Margaret?
Yeah, I think I agree with the previous speakers who pointed out to the need for continuous engagement. And in fact, in democratic countries, however deficit may be, the quality is, trying to get the issues to become an electoral agenda can also be a way, so that the government can be convinced that if they take the issues on board, then it will also be to their benefits to actually address these issues. And in this regard, I think civil society movements will play a key role. Thanks.
The next question is to Ms. Michelle. Can you share with us how the Indonesian government has responded to some of the vulnerabilities that you have highlighted?
Yeah, there are. Well, we are talking about the Ministry of Finance for this instance, and they know there is the vulnerability, there are the needs of children, and also the people with disabilities. However, it's not. I cannot say it's really a good response. They say that they already have the social assistance, the family help program that cover this vulnerable group, and however, it's also belong in another Ministry of Social, a social welfare. So yeah, they know about it, but yeah, I think it is also the problem of the lack of coordination among ministry in Indonesia, because the social assistance that is belong to this vulnerable group is belong in another ministry that we are finding hard time to approach it. Yeah, and yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a problem.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, that is a problem in here.
Thank you. This question is for the whole panel. So during the pandemic, we see the private sector has been stepping up and to a large extent plugging the gaps in addressing the socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic that governments cannot address. So in your respective countries or regions of study, can you share how the private sector can help address intractable vulnerabilities and structural inequalities? We will start with Dr. Malika and we will go down the list of speakers.
Yeah, for us, unfortunately, I think the way the lockdown followed the pandemic, and also now currently with another threat of lockdown on its way, the private sector has actually been stifled. And to some extent, you saw a bit of philanthropy, but it was the common citizens who actually rose up. Another question asked the same thing, which is at the grassroots level, how people got involved, started helping with the neighborhood, with people who are getting affected, rather than a private sector intervention in a major way. I think private sector got onto the act maybe a little later, but considering they were also deeply impacted economically, I don't see them moving forward. Yes, they do have the potential, but again, they will need a lot of SOPs from the government to do so. And at least in countries like India, it's the government which is the largest service provider which has the means to do it. Probably in a partnership with local citizenry to see what is required locally and how they can deliver. But still, I think the means to do things on a large scale, at least in countries like India, remains with the government. So the point is to see how we can get the government to act, to respond to particular situations, in addition to, and get advice from private sector and people, concerned citizenry on that.
Thank you. Ms. Michelle?
Yeah, I think it's also the same with what Bu Malika said earlier. Since the private sector, they also experience a hard economic shock. So I don't see we'll see any charity or assistance from them to, for example, also those for the structural inequalities. No, I don't see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Jyoti, please.
Okay, so I like to state an example. In the COVID times, the retail sector in India, in the world, in fact, the retail sector witnessed a shift in demand from China to India, which gave the local producers a chance to enter into newer lines of production activity. And again, from a gender perspective, this highlights the urgent need to upskill the women. With regard to the private sector, what happened was that nearly 12,000 small businesses in India have collaborated with private organizations like Amazon and Flipkart in the past few months, to do what? To primarily provide grocery supplies and e-commerce transportation to rural areas. The specific platforms for rural enterprises such as Flipkart Samarth. Yes, Flipkart Samarth is primarily for the rural women-led enterprises. And another example is Amazon Saheli. Amazon Saheli and Flipkart Samarth are playing a major role in bringing the products to the market in rural India. So this private government partnership is actually helping the women folk in India to address their day-to-day basic needs problems. Thank you.
Thank you. Margaret, please.
Well, yeah, I think in Singapore, the efforts to actually address vulnerability for people who are deeply impacted by this has also been driven primarily by the government. And because the private sector and businesses are also, many of them are also struggling because of the economic hardship.
Thank you. I have the next question. It may be directed to Dr. Jyoti and Dr. Malika. So you mentioned how women have specific climate vulnerabilities, including decreasing social security net, further pushback into their caregiving roles at home, and this has been further exacerbated by COVID-19. How do you think there can be this loss in progress? How do you think this loss in progress can be mitigated? Should there be more government intervention, top-down policies specifically targeting women at work, or perhaps a more grassroots intervention? So we will start with Dr. Malika, please.
Yeah, as I said, the government is one of the largest, if it wants to do, I think the capacity is large for the government. But I still believe, like while we did the SDG work, that SDGs form a great framework for meeting some of the gender targets that we want to do. So increasing the number of indicators, localizing more indicators, adding on to the SDG framework, I think is a great way to address some of these issues. Also because there's a lot of funding that's available. The central government has asked the state government as well as the local municipalities to allot their funding. So there is an SDG funding that is available in which they are able to look at how much they're spending for gender and all these other goals. So that is one way where we are finding funds, where we are finding the means. So easiest way would be to increase the number of indicators, and the government can do that with having an advisory board of gender experts who are there in the country who can say how various targets can be increased under the various goals, which can eventually help India in the long run.
Thank you. Dr. Jyoti?
Yeah, so I would just like to say it is both. Why I say both, you need government intervention and you need more grassroots intervention. In fact, there has to be, they both have to be interwoven, to have a successful and a holistic, not only policy framework, but also you need to check whether the policies that have been made have actually functioned and, sustained. So, we, I don't know, in South Asia, at least I can talk about India, we are making policies and programs, but the maintenance and the efficacy and the sustainability of policies is something which we actually should target at, and not just coming up with new policies time and again. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. The next question is a rather interesting one. I'm just going to paraphrase a bit. You've all talked about vulnerable communities and populations, but this question is specifically about how respective governments have undertaken to deal with vulnerable communities that may have fallen through the gaps. For example, migrant workers, migrant communities. And we can start with Dr. Malika, please.
Yeah. I think with India, it has been a case of too little, too late. With the lockdown that was announced almost overnight, there were like hundreds of thousands of people, and it was the biggest who were on the move. And I think it was the biggest human security catastrophe which was being played out on our television screens. So I think when you're talking about falling through the gap, I think that was one of the biggest issues that we had. And there have been various people who have suggested that it could have been done better, but unfortunately, the government missed out on that one. And I think the impact of that is still going to be huge, because some of those migrant laborers aren't returning, some are coming back, but the impact that it had on them is going to be phenomenal to even consider.
Thank you. Ms. Michelle, please.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not able to answer this because I didn't really have the skill to answer. And yeah, we are also not put attention to the migrant communities. We focus on the social assistance part and the poor people. We have not touched the migrant communities issue.
All right, no worries. Then I will just move on to Dr. Jyoti, please.
Okay, so in my presentation, I had mentioned about a woman from Nepal by the name of Lakshmi Bari, and she in fact worked on the migrants, the influx of migrants which came from India to Nepal. And in fact, this had exacerbated the, the divide between the marginalized community, that is the Dalits in Nepal, and the other community. So she on her own, with not much of government effort, but yes, the local community where she worked, the municipality did address her issue, and she in fact helped in mitigating that divide between the marginalized community and the other community staying in her village. So so that is one example where this lady Lakshmi Bari is 40 years old. She's a member of the ward committee and also the judicial committee of the Dipayali Sangeli municipality, which is located in Nepal. So her work is commendable on this. And with regard to the government support system, again, like I mentioned in my presentation, the Nai Manzil, the new destination enterprise, which is now world funded, was supported and started by the India's Ministry of Minority Affairs. And the benefits can be seen now when 50,700 Muslim women primarily, the majority, have been beneficiary of this program, which primarily relates to the school dropouts. So it's a second initiation or a second education for those school dropouts who cannot manage to educate themselves, but are given a secondary chance, a secondary education in terms of upskilling them so that they can establish their own ventures with the funding of the government. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Margaret, would you like to take this question?
Well, yeah, maybe just very, very briefly, I think the category of this particular vulnerable group that is being mentioned in the question, in the case of Singapore, I think is mostly relevant to those domestic workers or migrant workers who are not able to return to Singapore during this COVID-19, and therefore they're left stranded in their home countries and have lost, therefore, their chances for jobs or employments here. And for most of them, having jobs in Singapore probably is the only way of sustaining their lives. And of course, because they're not in this country, therefore the responsibility then falls on their respective governments to look after them. So this is where it becomes rather tricky, I think, because while they need to earn their living here, but because they are not able to come here because of the lockdowns and the border closure, then it will be their government's efforts then that have to be stepped up to protect them. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, while I have you on the screen, there's a question directly for you. Are there concrete examples of shifting away from the consumption-based growth model? If not, where can we start, as reluctance or resistance from the private sector and governments can be predicted?
Well, there has been, if not practical, because as you mentioned that the current global economic system is functioning based on a particular model. At least on paper, there has been attempts to model some kind of alternative solution to this. For example, a degrowth model. This is one of the solutions that academics and researchers have been looking into for a number of years and trying to basically project that prosperity and happiness for people is possible even without increasing material use or consumption. But of course, because this idea needs to be taken up and applied if real changes are to be made. So far, it has been basically studies and attempts to raise awareness of this particular alternative vision of economic growth model. So I think where things can start will be academic circles like and discussions like what we have today, and really a frank and open discussions among people that really ask the hard questions about whether the current economic model can really be sustainable. I mean, there are a number of sustainability concepts out there, including one of them will be circular economy, for example. But really, I think the questions need to be pressed harder, whether these are the things that basically still primarily based on consumption can be truly sustainable if the growth rate exceeds what circular economy is offering. If the net result is not, in the end of the day, still resulting in more and more resources being depleted. Yeah.
Thank you. We have another question, and this is directed to Ms. Michelle. Now, especially during the pandemic, did you find any chance where regional institutions such as ASEAN could take part in the efforts to minimize the impact of crisis on the vulnerable groups?
Yeah, I will try to answer. But I think the ASEAN, we currently have another major crisis, the one in Myanmar, and there are also crisis related to the Rohingya refugees. Yeah, yeah, it's hard to answer, but I think if we can make sure that each country have their own, meet their own safety and peace, it will be better. And I'm not sure that we can really help each other at giving subsidy or whatever, because each country are still battling itself. And yeah, and we also still find the problem in Myanmar too. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure that we can do about the impact crisis on the vulnerable groups in another country, but they should be work on in its own country first. That's from me.
Thank you. We have another interesting question, and this is directed to everyone in the panel. So it goes like this. So Southeast Asia, South Asia, Northeast Asia, with respect to sustainability challenges with pandemic, climate, carbon, downturn vulnerability, opens opportunity through positivism in cyberspace directed on health and well-being. So one solution is the spirit of ownership. Would you agree? Maybe you could take a minute to just read the question on the, because it's a bit long. And then we will start with Dr. Malika and we'll go down the row. So that's the last question there.
I don't know if I fully understand the question. Is it to say that in adversities, we should still try, those who are affected by it should take some kind of ownership and not expect the state to deliver?
I think it might be the other. I think it might be the other way, as in the states take the ownership.
Ownership of who? Because it says that it has generated a lot of positivism among people to do things
perhaps it's best we hear from the speaker, from the participant itself, if that's okay. I will just ask the question. Can we just see you, please, Dr. Salil?
Well, here I am. Thank you particularly to Professor Melly. I didn't have the information about this, but really very much appreciating this opportunity. Well, I have to please allow me to explain the research domain, which I am very passionate about, which is WWE_own equal to we own. And that's where this question has emanated from. We own is the proactive spirit of entrepreneurial ownership amongst the policymakers, processors, fintech, and bottom-up community. So here the spirit of ownership is because when vulnerability strikes, the pandemic strikes, or the extreme weather events strike, or the quality of life gets eroded, you don't wait for government intervention. You create your own solutions out there. There are many, many examples. We are talking of these three regions. Just look at Australia right now. In the last 2 months, they have been reeling one after another to extreme weather events. So the timing, the response time also should be factored in. Gender, climate, old age, young people, vulnerable people, below the poverty line people, these are fine. But here comes an opportunity of proactive entrepreneurial ownership, where the local private sector, the local governments, and most importantly, the community plays an aligned role.
Oh, okay, thank you, Dr. Salil. Would the panelists like to respond?
Yeah, we've seen that again repeatedly happening in most cases where we've had adversities, be it in earthquake or whether it is floods in Chennai or floods in Kerala. We've seen a whole lot of self-help groups and also people